thought you knew everything about war. Well, prepare for a story that will redefine your understanding of tactics and survival. Today, we'll delve into the events that unfolded on the island of Guam, where American Marines found themselves in a seemingly impossible situation. But what happened next proves that when you're cornered, you don't surrender. You become more dangerous than ever. July 25th, 1944. Fonte Plateau, Guam. In the dense tropical darkness, like ghosts, 3,200 Japanese soldiers silently advanced through the jungle, taking up positions around the exhausted Marines of the 3rd Division. The Americans had been fighting for days, their ammunition dwindling, their nerves frayed from continuous combat. Lieutenant Colonel Edward Wenzel's radio crackled with reports from his scattered positions. His men were stretched thin across the plateau, vulnerable and exposed. Every military doctrine stated the same. When outnumbered 3-1 and surrounded, you dig in and pray for reinforcements. The Japanese had done their homework. They knew exactly where the Marines slept. They knew which positions were the weakest. They knew the Americans had nowhere to run. When Lieutenant General Takeshi gave the final signal to attack, he was confident he would deliver a decisive blow that would crush American resistance on Guam forever. But the Japanese made one fatal assumption about what happens when you corner a United States Marine. Stay with us and watch until the end. We'd be especially grateful for a like and a subscription. And of course, don't forget to tell us in the comments where you're watching this video from. The first Japanese artillery shell pierced the night air at 003 How, its whistle cutting through the humid darkness like a blade. Lieutenant Colonel Edward Wenzel pressed his face into the muddy ground of his command post, feeling the earth tremble beneath him as an explosion ripped through the jungle 50 yards away. The counterattack had begun exactly as his intelligence reports predicted, but the ferocity of the bombardment surpassed all estimates his staff had prepared. The radio crackled in his ear as reports poured in from across Fonte Plateau. The 3rd Battalion was under heavy mortar fire from the north. The 2nd Battalion reported muzzle flashes moving along the tree line to the east. The hospital complex at Asen Point was already under small arms fire from Japanese infiltrators who had somehow breached the outer perimeter. Wenzel grabbed his radio and began issuing orders with the calm precision that had earned him the respect of every Marine under his command. He had been through Bougainville and knew that panic in the opening minutes of an assault could collapse an entire defense faster than enemy bullets. Captain Frank Bibb's voice cut through the radio static from his position on the eastern slope of the plateau. His 3rd Battalion was under attack by what sounded like an entire regiment of Japanese infantry, supported by knee mortars and machine guns that had been pre-positioned during daylight hours. The enemy had spent weeks studying American defensive patterns, identifying every foxhole, every supply route, every weak point in the Marine perimeter. They were executing a textbook encirclement, designed to cut off American units from their command structure and destroy them piecemeal before dawn. But Lieutenant General Takeshi based his calculations on European warfare tactics, where encircled forces typically surrendered or retreated when faced with overwhelming odds. He failed to account for the fundamental difference in how American Marines reacted to being cornered. As waves of Japanese assault crashed against the outer defensive positions, something unexpected began to happen. Instead of falling back or requesting permission to withdraw, individual Marine units began to dig in harder and fight with increased intensity. Private First Class James O'Connor crouched in his foxhole on the southeastern edge of the perimeter, watching tracer rounds streak through the darkness like angry fireflies. He had been in combat for exactly 11 days since landing on Guam, and this was the first time he had seen enemy soldiers moving in organized formations, rather than the desperate, isolated attacks of the previous week. Through his rifle sights, he could make out Japanese infantry advancing in 3 distinct waves, each larger than the last. The sight should have terrified him, but instead he felt something entirely different, a cold, focused fury that seemed to sharpen his vision and steady his hands. The Japanese had positioned their heaviest weaponry to target the Marine artillery positions first, understanding that American defensive doctrine relied heavily on coordinated fire support. But Wenzel had anticipated this tactic and redeployed his howitzers the previous afternoon, moving them to secondary positions that were not marked on any captured American map. As enemy mortars began to fall on empty gun emplacements, Marine artillery crews were already preparing to return fire from concealed positions 800 yards away. Sergeant Major William Hayes coordinated counter-battery fire with the methodical precision of a man who had been dropping artillery rounds on enemy positions since Guadalcanal. His forward observers relayed coordinates over encrypted radio channels, while Japanese infiltrators desperately searched for the source of the devastating American fire support. The 150mm howitzers began their work at 0345. Each shell was meticulously aimed at muzzle flashes and movement patterns that betrayed enemy positions. The Japanese committed almost their entire reserve to this single assault, believing that one overwhelming night attack would crush American morale and force a general retreat to the beaches. Intelligence reports had convinced Takeshi that the Marines were exhausted, undersupplied, and psychologically broken by 2 weeks of continuous fighting. What his staff failed to understand was that American units under extreme pressure did not break and run. They consolidated, adapted, and became exponentially more dangerous. At 040, the first wave of Japanese infantry reached the outer wire of the Marine defensive perimeter. They advanced through terrain that military doctrine considered impassable for organized units, using jungle trails and ravines that did not appear on American tactical maps. The assault was intended to achieve complete tactical surprise, overwhelming scattered Marine positions before a coordinated resistance could be organized. Instead, the Japanese found themselves in carefully prepared fields of fire that had been registered and rehearsed over the previous week. Imagine a scene where seemingly ordinary privates, corporals, and privates first class transformed into an unyielding wall of fire, demonstrating precision honed to perfection, as if they had been preparing for this exact moment for months. Machine gun crews, armed with water-cooled Browning M1917s, unleashed a continuous stream of bullets on the enemy, reaching 600 rounds per minute. They created interlocking fields of fire through which no infantry column could possibly break. The Japanese command undoubtedly anticipated American resistance, but they utterly failed to account for their fierce determination, which surpassed all their calculations. Many strategies rely on the inevitable appearance of breaches in an enemy's defense after the initial strike. But the moment Captain Bibb, observing through his field binoculars, saw the enemy's second wave unsuccessfully attempting to find such gaps in the Marine lines, it became clear conventional calculations wouldn't work here. Japanese tactics, based on continuous pressure, were designed to eventually expose vulnerabilities in any defensive position, allowing subsequent forces to exploit breakthroughs and collapse the entire perimeter from within. However, to their complete astonishment, these weak points simply did not emerge. Every position under massive assault did not weaken. On the contrary, it only grew stronger as Marines from adjacent sectors, without waiting for orders from above, quickly moved to reinforce threatened areas. This was the first sign that something entirely different from mere resistance was unfolding. If you're still with us, it means this story has captivated you. Stay until the very end, because it's only going to get more interesting. We'd be especially grateful for a like and a subscription. And of course, don't forget to write in the comments where you're watching from. The conventional wisdom held that the technological superiority of American forces, so evident in daylight operations, should be completely nullified by pitch darkness and close-quarters combat. Japanese strategists deliberately chose a night assault, assuming it would prevent American units from utilizing their superior artillery, air support, and armored vehicles. But they failed to account for one crucial factor. The Marines had spent months relentlessly adapting their equipment and tactics precisely for such conditions. Radio communication remained crystal clear and effective, as if it were daylight. Coordination between infantry, artillery, and supporting forces continued to function with devastating efficiency, demonstrating a level of synergy that seemed impossible in the utter darkness. This was more than just a battle. It was a lesson in adaptation and an unyielding spirit. If you haven't liked and subscribed yet, now's the time to do it. Your support helps us create these stories. And don't forget to mention in the comments where you're following this captivating narrative from. By 5 o'clock in the morning, the Japanese third wave was advancing through the scattered remnants of their first two assault formations. This attack had cost them nearly 800 casualties in less than 2 hours. Yet General Takeshi, despite the clear evidence, continued to believe that American resistance was weakening. His field commanders reported that Marine positions were still holding, but in his mind, this was merely the death throes of a broken force that would collapse after one more concentrated push. What the Japanese general utterly failed to grasp was that he was facing the most dangerous phenomenon in infantry warfare: United States Marines, who had made a firm decision not to retreat. This decision was not merely a tactical move, but a manifestation of will capable of changing the outcome of any battle. Lieutenant General Takeshi, carefully reviewing the battlefield reports that gradually arrived from his assault commanders, felt the first icy touches of doubt permeate his calculations. His staff had assured him that American resistance would collapse within 3 hours of continuous assault. But the sun was already beginning to rise over Fonte Plateau, and Marine positions remained intact across the entire front. Even more alarming were the casualty figures that his regimental commanders reluctantly relayed over encrypted radio channels. The 29th Infantry Division had already lost nearly half its combat effectiveness, and the planned breakthrough to the divisional hospital had been completely halted. This was the moment when reality began to mercilessly diverge from expectations and the consequences of this divergence were catastrophic. At 5:30 in the morning, the Japanese general committed his last reserve, sending his most seasoned infantry regiment in a desperate attempt to breach the Marine perimeter before full daylight exposed his forces to American artillery and air power. These were soldiers who had been through the China campaign and survived brutal island battles across the Pacific for the previous 2 years. They advanced with the disciplined precision of veterans who understood that this assault would determine whether organized Japanese resistance on Guam would continue or collapse entirely. However, something had gone fundamentally wrong with Japanese intelligence regarding American defensive capabilities. The Marines were not behaving like cornered and demoralized forces awaiting evacuation. On the contrary, they fought with the coordinated intensity of a unit that had made a decision to hold its ground at all costs. This was not merely a fight for territory, but a battle of wills, where each side demonstrated its ultimate tenacity. Intercepted radio communications revealed a startling fact. American commanders were not just requesting more ammunition, they were asking for permission to launch counterattacks against Japanese positions weakened by the failed night assault. Meanwhile, Sergeant Taro Matsuole led his squad through a narrow ravine, which had apparently been missed by American intelligence during the initial survey of the plateau. His mission was to infiltrate the hospital complex near Asan Point and eliminate the medical personnel caring for wounded Marines. Japanese tactical doctrine emphasized that destroying enemy medical capabilities would force American units to choose between abandoning their wounded or committing additional forces to defend the hospital, thereby creating opportunities to exploit this advantage elsewhere along the perimeter. It was a cunning plan, designed to undermine morale and disrupt logistics. But here, too, the Japanese were in for a surprise. This 20-man infiltration squad had diligently trained for 3 weeks for this specific mission on a mock-up of the facility specially constructed behind Japanese lines. They knew the precise layout of the hospital complex inside and out, the location of every tent and supply bunker, the medical staff's shift schedules, and the likely defensive positions Marines might occupy around the perimeter. What they absolutely did not expect was to encounter a reinforced squad of Marines who had been specifically assigned to counter infiltration after intelligence reports predicted precisely this type of attack. Their meticulous preparation met an even more meticulous foresight from the enemy. Private First Class O'Connor had been transferred to the hospital guard detail 6 hours before the Japanese assault began, part of a defensive adjustment implemented by Lieutenant Colonel Wenzel based on intercepted enemy radio traffic. The young Marine had never before engaged in close-quarters combat against enemy infiltrators, but his training had prepared him precisely for this scenario. When Matsuole's squad emerged from the ravine at exactly 6 o'clock in the morning, they found themselves facing pre-established positions defended by Marines, who were already waiting for them. This was the moment of truth, where months of training and intelligence converged. The firefight that erupted around the hospital complex lasted exactly 17 minutes and starkly demonstrated the fundamental problem that was dismantling Japanese assault capabilities across Fonte Plateau. American units were not merely defending predetermined positions. They were actively adapting their tactics based on real-time battlefield developments. Marine squads regrouped for mutual support without waiting for orders from above, creating interlocking fields of fire that eliminated any gaps and weak points designed to be exploited by Japanese infiltration tactics. This was an example not just of resilience, but of a living, adaptive defense that turned every enemy attack into its own trap. It's incredible, but true. Even the most meticulously planned strategies sometimes crumble in the face of unexpected circumstances. Perhaps you've encountered situations where it seemed all efforts were futile and a way out of a deadlock felt like an impossible dream. But it is precisely in such moments that the true value of adaptation and ingenuity shines through. Today, we delve into the events of one of World War II's most dramatic nights, where the Japanese offensive on Guam, initially designed as a crushing blow, turned into a complete collapse. Why did this happen? The answer lies in a series of fatal miscalculations and brilliant decisions that completely shifted the balance of power. And here's the first of them. Japanese commanders, confident in their superiority, overlooked critically important details that became their Achilles' heel. What exactly were these miscalculations? Captain Bibb, commanding the American forces, received alarming yet encouraging reports from his forward observers. Japanese supply columns had begun to withdraw from the advanced positions they had occupied during the night assault. The enemy's ammunition expenditure during the first 5 hours of combat was colossal, and the Japanese logistical capabilities proved entirely unable to sustain the intensity of fighting their own offensive plan demanded. Even more significantly, intercepted radio communications revealed that Japanese commanders were beginning to lose contact with many of their subordinate units, as American artillery methodically destroyed enemy command posts and communication equipment. Chui. The technological advantages developed by American forces over 2 years of fighting in the Pacific proved decisive in ways neither side had fully anticipated. Marine artillery crews employed advanced fire adjustment methods and radio coordination procedures, allowing them to deliver precise fire support within minutes of receiving target coordinates. Japanese forces, accustomed to fighting adversaries with limited artillery capabilities, found themselves under constant bombardment from guns they could neither locate nor counter. Stay with us and watch until the end. We'd be especially grateful for a like and a subscription. And of course, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. At 0645, Lieutenant Colonel Wenzel authorized the deployment of M4 Sherman tanks, which had been held in reserve during the night fighting. 5 medium tanks advanced along predetermined routes cleared of obstacles the previous week. Their 37mm guns and coaxial machine guns engaged Japanese positions at ranges inaccessible to enemy infantry weapons. The tanks moved slowly through the jungle, but their presence radically altered the tactical balance of the battle. Japanese anti-tank capabilities on Guam consisted mainly of individual soldiers carrying magnetic mines and satchel charges, weapons requiring extremely close approach to be effective. These armored vehicles operated in close coordination with Marine infantry squads, who prevented enemy soldiers from approaching within effective range. Simultaneously, the tanks' armor protection allowed them to advance into areas where unprotected infantry simply could not survive. Each Sherman carried enough ammunition to sustain continuous combat for several hours, providing consistent fire support that Japanese forces were utterly unable to neutralize. The psychological impact of American armor proved as significant as its tactical effectiveness. Japanese soldiers, having endured hours of artillery barrages and machine gun fire, suddenly faced combat platforms that seemed invulnerable to their available anti-tank methods. Later, reports from captured Japanese soldiers revealed that many units began to lose combat effectiveness as Marine counterattacks, supported by tanks, developed across multiple sectors of the front. Stay with us and watch until the end. We'd be especially grateful for a like and a subscription. And of course, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. By 7 p.m., Lieutenant General Takashina was receiving reports that his assault forces had begun to withdraw from forward positions without authorization from higher command. Individual Japanese units were making independent decisions to retreat when their tactical situation became untenable. This was a complete breakdown of military discipline, indicating the final collapse of the counteroffensive. The general had committed his entire strategic reserve to this single attack, and the breakdown of coordinated resistance meant that the organized Japanese defense of Guam had effectively ended. The hospital complex that Sergeant Matsule had attempted to seize remained securely in American hands. The veteran Japanese infiltration specialist lay dead in a drainage ditch 50 yards from his objective, killed by a 19-year-old private first-class Marine who had been in combat for less than 2 weeks. Around him, scattered equipment and the bodies of his infiltration team marked the farthest point of Japanese penetration into the American defensive perimeter. Captain Bibb established radio contact with his battalion commander and requested permission to pursue the retreating Japanese forces, but Wenzel ordered all Marine units to maintain their defensive positions until the full extent of the enemy's withdrawal could be determined. American casualties were surprisingly light, given the intensity of the night assault, but ammunition expenditure had been colossal, and resupply operations were necessary before any major offensive actions could be undertaken. The sun rose higher over Fonte Plateau, illuminating a battlefield where the strategic balance of power on Guam had decisively shifted in 6 hours of darkness. Japanese forces, which began the night with overwhelming numerical superiority, were now scattered, demoralized, and incapable of launching another coordinated attack. The Marines, who had been surrounded and outnumbered, not only survived, but had effectively destroyed the Japanese offensive capability in a single engagement. The morning sun cast long shadows across Fonte Plateau as Lieutenant Colonel Wenzel surveyed a battlefield transformed by 6 hours of desperate fighting. The bodies of Japanese soldiers lay strewn across the approaches to the Marine positions in patterns that eloquently told the tactical story of a failed assault. The enemy had thrown all its strength into this single attack and lost not only the battle, but its ability to organize resistance anywhere on Guam. Wenzel's radio operator handed him a message from division headquarters, authorizing an immediate advance to secure the plateau and eliminate remaining pockets of Japanese resistance. Private First Class O'Connor climbed out of his foxhole near the hospital complex and began the grim task of counting enemy casualties in his sector. 17 Japanese soldiers had died trying to break through to the medical facility, including the infiltration specialist, whose equipment and documents could provide valuable intelligence on enemy capabilities and intentions. The young Marine had fired his M1 Garand rifle 43 times during the night's battle, each shot aimed with the precision months of training had drilled into his muscle memory. He felt no satisfaction in killing, but understood his actions had saved the lives of wounded Marines who would have died without medical attention. Imagine a situation where everything around you is collapsing, where the enemy outnumbers you, and every minute feels like your last. What would you do? Surrender, or find the strength within you to turn the tide of seemingly predetermined events? Perhaps you think that the outcome of war is always decided by brute force or numerical advantage, but the history of Guam will show you something entirely different, something that will make you reconsider your views on survival and victory. For what happened here, on these sun-drenched slopes, was not just a battle. It was a clash of wills, where one side, on the brink of annihilation, managed not only to hold its ground, but to turn defeat into triumph. We will tell you how, in a matter of hours, the entire picture of the fighting changed. How despair gave way to determination, and chaos to cool-headed calculation. Captain Bibb and his 3rd Battalion received orders to advance towards the very heights that had recently been held by Japanese forces. The enemy, having suffered a crushing defeat in the night battle, was retreating in such disarray that they left behind invaluable equipment and supplies. Among the abandoned property, even artillery pieces were found, which could have posed a serious obstacle had the Japanese command managed to maintain any semblance of control over its units. Marine intelligence scouts would spend many more days cataloging everything found. But an even more crucial discovery was the evident breakdown of the Japanese troops' command and communication system, which led to their failed offensive. Meanwhile, powerful M4 Sherman tanks, which played a key role in the final stages of the night battle, began their ascent of Fonte Plateau. At precisely Zor 8:30, 5 medium tanks moved in a coordinated formation, their crews carefully scanning the surroundings for anti-tank positions or potential obstacles that could slow their advance. However, the Japanese defense was entirely focused on repelling American infantry attacks, which, as it turned out, was a fatal mistake. Stay with us and watch until the end. We'd be especially grateful for a like and a subscription. And of course, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The rapid collapse of organized resistance meant that most anti-tank weaponry was either abandoned or destroyed during the hasty retreat. Lieutenant General Takashina, realizing the hopelessness of the situation, established his last command post within a cave system on the northern edge of the plateau. He was surrounded only by scattered remnants of units, almost completely wiped out during the failed counteroffensive. Staff officers reported that the combat effectiveness of Japanese forces on Guam had dwindled to fewer than 1,000 soldiers, most of whom were isolated in small groups, lacking communication and coordination with higher command. The general understood that organized resistance was no longer possible, but Japanese military doctrine required him to fight to the death without surrendering. Stay with us and watch until the end. We'd be especially grateful for a like and a subscription. And of course, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Marine artillerymen began a methodical destruction of suspected Japanese positions throughout the plateau area, using coordinates obtained from forward observers and aerial reconnaissance. 155mm howitzers unleashed high-explosive shells with devastating accuracy, eliminating cave complexes and fortified strong points that could serve as refuge for enemy forces attempting to reorganize for further resistance. Each artillery mission was carefully planned to minimize civilian casualties while ensuring the complete suppression of Japanese military potential. By noon on July 27th, forward elements of the 21st Marine Regiment had reached positions overlooking the entire northern part of Guam. The tactical situation had completely reversed from the desperate defensive fighting of the previous night. American forces now controlled the commanding heights and possessed overwhelming superiority in artillery, armor, and air support. Japanese forces were reduced to small groups, hiding in caves and jungles, incapable of coordinated action and being systematically destroyed through search and destroy operations. Company A encountered the largest remaining concentration of Japanese resistance at 2:00 p.m., when approximately 60 enemy soldiers attempted to establish a defensive position in a ravine that offered natural protection from American artillery. The fight lasted 45 minutes and clearly demonstrated the fundamental tactical changes that had occurred since the failed night assault. Japanese soldiers fought with desperate bravery, but lacked the weapons, ammunition, and coordination necessary to halt the advancing Marine units, supported by tanks and artillery. Lieutenant General Takashina's death occurred during this final engagement, as the Japanese commander attempted to lead one last desperate charge against American positions. Marine riflemen eliminated the general and his staff officers with accurate fire, leading to the eradication of Japanese leadership and effectively ending organized resistance in that sector. The demise of the senior Japanese commander symbolized the complete collapse of enemy defensive capabilities and marked the beginning of the final phase of operations to secure Guam. Private First Class O'Connor participated in the advance that cleared the ravine where Takashina made his last stand. The young Marine had transformed from a frightened recruit into a combat veteran in less than 24 hours of intense fighting. His actions during the defense of the hospital earned the recognition of his squad leader and demonstrated the transformation that combat experience produces in American soldiers surviving their first major engagement. The confidence and tactical knowledge he gained proved invaluable in the remaining operations to secure the island. Marine engineers began clearing routes for supply vehicles and establishing communication lines to support further operations against scattered Japanese resistance throughout Guam. The logistical capabilities possessed by American forces gave them decisive advantages in prolonged combat operations. While Japanese soldiers were forced to forage for food and ammunition, Marine units received regular resupply of everything necessary to maintain combat effectiveness for weeks or even months of additional fighting. By 6 p.m. on July 29th, organized Japanese resistance on Fonte Plateau had been completely suppressed. Marine patrols reported contact with only individuals and small groups that posed no threat to American control of the strategic heights. The battle, which began with Japanese forces surrounding and outnumbering American defensive positions, concluded with the complete destruction of the enemy's offensive capabilities and the establishment of secure American control over the most critical geographical features on Guam. Lieutenant Colonel Wells established his command post in the cave complex that Lieutenant General Takashina had used in his final hours, symbolically occupying the position from which Japanese resistance had been coordinated. The American victory was achieved through superior tactics, technology, and training, but most importantly, through the fighting spirit of individual Marines who refused to be defeated despite all the odds they faced. The 21st Marine Regiment demonstrated that American infantry units possessed capabilities that enemy commanders had fundamentally underestimated. Imagine a night when everything went wrong. When the enemy outnumbers you, surrounds you on all sides, cutting you off from reinforcements. It seems like the end, doesn't it? Well, that's exactly the kind of night experienced by those who stood on Fonte Plateau, trapped in what seemed like an inescapable predicament. But what happened next rewrote military history textbooks. In this video, we will reveal how the impossible became reality and show 3 key moments that turned an impending defeat into one of the most stunning victories of the Pacific Campaign. Do you think you know what victory looks like under such conditions? Forget everything you've been told about numerical superiority. This battle will prove the opposite, exposing the true power of spirit and tactics. The aftermath of this clash on Guam revealed casualty reports that eloquently told the full scale of the engagement. Japanese forces lost approximately 3,200 soldiers killed, with virtually all remaining personnel either wounded or scattered across the island in small groups. American casualties totaled fewer than 200 killed and wounded, a ratio that undeniably demonstrated the decisive nature of the tactical triumph. More importantly, the destruction of Japanese offensive capabilities meant that the remaining enemy forces on Guam could offer only symbolic resistance to American operations aimed at fully securing the island. Stay with us and watch until the end to learn all the details of this incredible story. We'd be especially grateful for a like and a subscription. And of course, don't forget to tell us in the comments where you're watching this video from. The captain leading the defense submitted his after-action report, detailing the tactical innovations that proved decisive in this night battle. American defensive doctrine had evolved over months of fighting in the Pacific, emphasizing flexibility, coordination, and aggressive responses to enemy attacks. The Marines who held Fonte Plateau embodied the pinnacle of military training and combat experience that transformed American infantry into the most effective fighting force in the Pacific theater. The silence that fell over Fonte Plateau on the morning of July 30th carried a weight that pressed upon the consciousness of every Marine who survived that night that changed everything. To not miss a single detail of this astonishing story, stay with us and watch until the very end. We would be especially grateful for your like and subscription, as it helps us create more content like this. And please tell us in the comments where you are joining us from. Private First Class O'Connor sat on the edge of his foxhole, cleaning his M1 Garand rifle with the methodical precision instilled in him by combat. His hands moved automatically, while his mind struggled to comprehend what he had experienced and accomplished. The hospital complex where he had killed his first enemy soldier now lay peacefully in the morning sunlight. But memories of muzzle flashes and desperate calls for ammunition would haunt him for decades. The field captain moved among his men, checking on wounded Marines and ensuring the proper distribution of ammunition and medical supplies. He saw in their faces the same haunted expression he recognized in his own reflection. In 6 hours of desperate fighting, they had accomplished something extraordinary. But the cost of that achievement was etched in an exhaustion that ran deeper than physical fatigue. These were men who had stared into the face of their own mortality and discovered reserves of courage and determination they never knew they possessed. The bodies of Japanese soldiers, scattered across the plateau, told a story of tactical miscalculation and strategic failure that military historians would study for generations. Lieutenant General Takashina had committed all his forces to a single assault that, by all principles of conventional warfare, should have succeeded. The Americans were outnumbered, surrounded, and cut off from reinforcements. And yet something fundamental in the character of Marine Corps training and leadership transformed what should have been a defeat into a victory so complete that organized Japanese resistance on Guam was permanently eliminated. Lieutenant Colonel Wells established a temporary memorial near his command post, using a piece of shrapnel-scarred metal to mark the spot where 17 Marines had died defending positions they refused to abandon. The names of the fallen were engraved on the makeshift monument with a combat knife, creating a permanent record of sacrifice that would outlast the war itself. Wells understood that his men needed time to process what they had endured, but the tactical situation demanded continued operations to secure the remainder of the island before scattered Japanese forces could reorganize. Medical personnel worked tirelessly, providing aid to Marines wounded during the night battle. The hospital near Agate Point, which the sergeant had attempted to capture, remained fully functional throughout the engagement. The Japanese infiltration mission, which aimed to destroy American medical capabilities, completely failed, ensuring wounded Marines received immediate treatment that saved dozens of lives. Navy corpsmen moved among the casualties with the quiet professionalism that made them legends among the infantry they served, providing care that turned potentially fatal wounds into recoverable ones. The psychological impact of this battle extended far beyond the immediate participants, affecting Japanese civilians across the Pacific, who had been told that American forces were weak and demoralized. Radio broadcasts from Tokyo promised that the counteroffensive on Guam would demonstrate Japanese military superiority and force the United States to negotiate a favorable peace settlement. Instead, the complete destruction of Japanese offensive capabilities exposed a fundamental weakness in enemy strategic planning and the growing strength of American military capabilities. Private First Class O'Connor received word that his actions during the defense of the hospital had earned him a Bronze Star with a Combat Phi, an acknowledgement that seemed unreal to a young man who had been consumed by terror for much of the battle. His squad leader explained that courage was not the absence of fear, but the ability to act effectively despite it, a lesson that served him well throughout his subsequent military service. The medal represented not just individual heroism, but the collective achievement of Marines who refused to be defeated, no matter the odds they faced. Marine intelligence teams spent days interrogating captured Japanese soldiers and examining abandoned equipment to understand how enemy forces had achieved tactical surprise despite American surveillance capabilities. The infiltration routes and assault methods employed by Japanese commanders demonstrated sophisticated planning and preparation that should have led to a successful attack. The failure of such a well-conceived operation showed that American defensive doctrine had evolved to counter enemy tactical innovations through superior training and leadership. Imagine a night when the shadow of imminent defeat looms over you, when every rustle in the dark seems like a harbinger of the end, and an enemy, vastly superior in numbers, is ready to wipe you from the face of the earth. What if we told you that it is precisely in such moments, when everything seems to go wrong, that the most incredible victories are born? Perhaps you too have faced situations where familiar rules broke down, and what seemed like a mistake actually proved to be the only path to salvation. Today, we will delve into a story that will make you rethink everything you've been taught about strategy and survival. This battle on Guam is not just a page in a textbook. It's a practical guide on how to turn the tide when all the cards are against you, and how the mistakes you make daily can be your greatest advantage. Stay with us and watch until the end. We'd be especially grateful for a like and a subscription, and of course let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Such was the night on Fonte Plateau, where American Marines faced a furious onslaught from Japanese forces. Here, in the pitch black, when every step could be their last, decisions were made that would forever change military doctrine. You'll learn about the key principles that help transform a desperate defense into a crushing defeat. A captain, whose name would be etched in history, presented detailed recommendations for tactical changes based on the lessons learned from the night battle. He recognized that defensive positions required significantly better communication between adjacent units and improved coordination with supporting artillery and armor. The success of Japanese infiltration attempts clearly demonstrated the acute need for additional anti-infiltration patrols and more effective early warning systems. Most importantly, however, this battle showed that Marine Corps units operated most effectively when individual initiative was encouraged rather than suppressed by rigid adherence to predetermined plans. This lesson, seemingly simple yet so fundamental, continues to be felt to this day, meaning many more discoveries await us. Amidst these fateful tactical changes, recognition was swift. Lieutenant Colonel Well was promoted to full colonel and assigned to the division staff, a well-deserved acknowledgement of his exceptional leadership, which proved crucial during the most critical period of the Guam campaign. His tactical innovations and cool-headed decision-making under extreme pressure averted a potential disaster, transforming a defensive battle into a decisive victory. The methods he developed would later be incorporated into Marine Corps doctrine and taught in military academies for decades after the war. But what did this mean for the enemy? How did this single battle change the course of the entire Pacific War? The strategic implications of the Battle of Fonte Plateau resonated throughout the Pacific theater of operations. Japanese commanders realized with horror that the capabilities of American infantry far exceeded their previous assessments. The complete annihilation of numerically superior forces in a single engagement demonstrated that traditional tactical approaches were ineffective against an adversary who combined superior technology with exceptional training and leadership. The analysis of events on Guam fundamentally altered Japanese defensive planning for the remaining strongholds in the Pacific. But how did those in the thick of the fight experience these events, and how did it change them? Stay with us and watch until the end. We'd be especially grateful for a like and a subscription. And of course, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. While the battle raged on Fonte Plateau, another war was beginning beyond its confines, a war of reconstruction. Immediately after the organized Japanese resistance ceased, the revitalization of Guam began, with Marine engineers and Navy construction battalions, known as Seabees, working tirelessly to repair the destruction caused by weeks of fierce fighting. The airfield, which would later become the launching point for B-29 bombers striking the Japanese mainland, was expanded and improved, drawing on experience gained from previous Pacific campaigns. Local residents who had endured the Japanese occupation received medical aid and essential supplies, marking the beginning of the restoration of civil administration under American authority. This was just the start of monumental changes made possible by those who displayed unwavering resolve at the most critical moment. Private First Class O'Connor was evacuated to a hospital in Hawaii for treatment of wounds that proved more severe than initially thought. However, just 3 months later, he returned to combat and participated in the assault on Iwo Jima. The experience of survival in his first major engagement transformed him from a raw recruit into a seasoned veteran, whose skills and knowledge proved invaluable in subsequent operations. His personal evolution mirrored the broader transformation of American military capabilities throughout the Pacific War. But what was the true cost of this victory, and what did it signify in the context of the entire campaign? The final casualty count revealed the true scale of what had been achieved in 6 hours of desperate fighting. Japanese forces suffered 3,200 killed, with fewer than 100 prisoners taken, and the rest scattered across the island in disorganized groups. American casualties totaled 197 killed and wounded, a ratio that demonstrated not only tactical superiority, but also fundamental differences in military effectiveness that ultimately determined the outcome of the Pacific War. The Marines holding Fonte Plateau understood they were part of something historically significant, but the full implications of their feat would only become clear decades later, when military historians analyzed this battle within the context of Pacific theater operations. They proved that American infantry possessed capabilities that enemy commanders had severely underestimated, capabilities that would prove decisive in every subsequent campaign of the war. And this is only part of the story that continues to unfold. 3 months after the Battle of Fonte Plateau, Colonel Wells stood in the operations center of the newly constructed airbase, which now occupied the very ground where Japanese forces had launched their last desperate assault. A massive runway stretched across the area that, just 6 hours of fierce fighting ago, had been soaked in blood. Now, heavy B-29 superfortresses taxied along the concrete surface, preparing for bombing missions against the Japanese mainland. The transformation of Guam from a contested battlefield into a strategic bomber base symbolized a broader shift in Pacific theater operations, made possible by the Marine victory. But what happened to those who fought shoulder to shoulder with the colonel? And how did their experiences transform them and future generations? Private First Class O'Connor, now recovered from his wounds and promoted to corporal, served as a squad leader in the 4th Marine Division, preparing for the assault on Iwo Jima. His experience in the night battle on Guam earned him recognition as one of the most tactically astute junior, non-commissioned officers in his battalion. More importantly, however, this experience gave him the confidence and combat knowledge needed to train new recruits who would face similar challenges in future operations. The lessons he learned defending the hospital complex were now being passed down to young Marines who would carry these methods into the final campaigns of the Pacific War. So how did these personal lessons become part of the entire war machine? The tactical innovations that proved decisive during the Battle of Fonte Plateau were actively incorporated into Marine Corps doctrine through training programs established at bases across the Pacific region. Officers and senior enlisted personnel who participated in the battle served as instructors, sharing practical knowledge on defensive coordination, anti-infiltration methods, and the integration of artillery and armored support. The Corps' institutional memory was enriched by combat experience that would influence military thought for decades after the war. But how quickly did these new ideas spread and change the approach to warfare as a whole? A major commanding a battalion reviewed reports of recent operations that demonstrated how widely the tactical lessons of Guam had been adopted. Marine units throughout the Pacific region applied defensive methods that emphasized flexibility and an aggressive response to enemy attacks, rather than passive resistance from fixed positions. The psychological transformation that occurred during the night battle was replicated in training programs that taught Marines to view encirclement not as a prelude to defeat, but as an opportunity to destroy enemy forces that had exposed themselves to concentrated fire. This was not just a victory in one battle. It was the rebirth of an entire army, changing the course of history. Have you ever felt that despite all your efforts and careful preparation, the threat of complete collapse looms over you? A moment when it seems you're doing everything right, but inevitable failure is already knocking at the door. Many are familiar with this feeling, and today we will transport ourselves into history to understand how an entire army faced this sensation, yet managed not only to endure, but to completely rethink its strategy. This is a story of how one battle, seemingly a failure for one side, became a catalyst for unprecedented changes for the other, and how the lessons of that battle are still relevant today. Japanese military analysts, meticulously studying the catastrophic fiasco of their counteroffensive on Guam, arrived at conclusions that did not merely adjust, but radically overturned all their strategic planning for the remainder of the war. Imagine forces numerically superior to the enemy were wiped off the face of the earth in a single engagement. How could this happen? And what does it say about our own assumptions? It was here, on a tiny island, that a mistake was made, one you might be repeating in your own life without realizing it. Stay with us and watch until the end to fully uncover this incredible story. We'd be especially grateful for a like and a subscription. And of course, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Imagine you meticulously plan an operation, possess all the intelligence on the enemy, and even outnumber them. And then, everything collapses. This was the shock faced by Japanese military strategists as they meticulously analyzed the crushing failure of their operation on Guam. Their conclusions didn't just make adjustments, they completely reshaped strategic thinking for the remainder of the war. Intelligence reports clearly indicated that the combat capabilities of American infantry surpassed all previous calculations, especially in such critical aspects as small unit leadership, tactical coordination, and the effective use of supporting arms. The complete annihilation of numerically superior forces in a single engagement served as undeniable proof. Traditional Japanese tactics were utterly ineffective against an enemy who skillfully combined advanced technology with outstanding training and an unwavering fighting spirit. This failure became a harbinger of the strategic shifts to come, which we will examine next. The strategic consequences of the Battle of Fonte Plateau had a colossal impact on the defensive preparations of Japanese forces bracing for the battles of Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and even the defense of the Japanese home islands themselves. The military command realized that frontal assaults against well-fortified American positions would inevitably lead to catastrophic losses without yielding any tactical advantages. New defensive doctrines began to emphasize protracted resistance from pre-prepared positions, completely abandoning counter-offensive operations aimed at pushing American forces back to their landing sites. The psychological shock of the defeat on Guam convinced Japanese strategists that their troops were no longer capable of achieving decisive victories over American infantry in open combat. This realization changed not only plans, but also the perception of American soldiers, whose stories would soon spread throughout the Pacific region. Marines wounded during the night battle and evacuated to hospitals in Hawaii and the continental United States unwittingly became living witnesses and messengers, recounting the evolution of American ground forces' combat capabilities. Their battle narratives, shared with medical personnel, high-ranking officials, and war correspondents, contributed to a widespread understanding that the Pacific War had entered an entirely new phase. This phase was characterized by undeniable American tactical and technological superiority. Stay with us and watch until the end to fully uncover this incredible story. We'd be especially grateful for a like and a subscription. And of course, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. The transformation of yesterday's recruits into hardened veterans in just one night of fighting demonstrated the exceptional effectiveness of Marine Corps training programs and leadership development systems. The technological advantages that proved decisive during the Battle of Fonte Plateau were not merely copied, but actively improved and implemented across the Pacific theater of operations, leading to concrete innovations. Radio communication systems, which allowed Marine units to effectively coordinate defensive fire and provide mutual support, underwent modernization, receiving more powerful transmitters and enhanced encryption capabilities. Artillery techniques, developed and refined during that battle, were standardized and made mandatory for the training of crews supporting operations from the Philippines to the Central Pacific. Tank infantry cooperation procedures were also refined and improved based on lessons learned from the successful defense against Japanese infiltration attacks. All these improvements were the result of the work of not only ordinary soldiers, but also outstanding commanders. Colonel Well, whose tactical acumen emerged at a critical moment, received an assignment to the Pacific Fleet staff. There, his experience was immediately applied to planning operations for the final phase of the war against Japan. His in-depth analysis of the Battle of Guam critically influenced strategic thinking regarding amphibious assault methods and defensive actions in the capture of future objectives. The institutional knowledge he gained during 6 hours of desperate fighting was now scaled and applied to campaigns that would involve hundreds of thousands of American service members and ultimately determine the outcome of the entire Pacific War. While military strategies changed, Guam itself also underwent incredible transformations. The reconstruction of Guam proceeded at an astonishing pace, transforming the island from a devastated battlefield into a major military base capable of supporting strategic bomber operations against Japan. The civilian population, who had survived the Japanese occupation, was provided with medical care, food, and housing. And while civil government was restored under American administration, the stark contrast between Japanese occupation policies and American reconstruction efforts vividly demonstrated the differences in values and capabilities represented by the opposing sides in the Pacific conflict. These massive changes were possible thanks to the heroism of every soldier, even those who were initially terrified. Private First Class O'Connor was awarded the Bronze Star in a ceremony attended by Marines who had fought alongside him during the hospital defense. However, the true significance of his actions extended far beyond simple individual recognition. His transformation from a frightened recruit into a confident combat leader symbolized the massive transformation the Marine Corps was undertaking, with thousands of young Americans. Many of them could not even imagine possessing the courage and capability required for sustained combat. This culture, fostering such rapid development of combat effectiveness, soon became a subject of study. The institutional culture that fostered such rapid development of combat effectiveness was actively studied and adopted by military organizations of all allied nations. The final phase of clearance operations on Guam revealed the full extent of Japanese losses resulting from the failed counteroffensive. Burial teams, working under the supervision of Marine engineers and Navy medical personnel, processed the remains of 3,200 enemy soldiers, ensuring a dignified burial despite the circumstances of their deaths. The respect shown to fallen enemies reflected the high professional standards that characterized American military operations and contributed to subsequent reconciliation between former adversaries in the post-war period. But what allowed the Americans to be so prepared? Intelligence gathered from captured documents and prisoner interrogations revealed the detailed planning that preceded the Japanese assault on Fonte Plateau. Enemy commanders possessed accurate information regarding American defensive positions, troop strength, and tactical procedures. Yet they were utterly unprepared for the combat spirit and tactical adaptability that Marine Corps units demonstrated during this decisive engagement. The failure of such a meticulously planned operation provided valuable insights into the fundamental differences between American and Japanese military cultures and their relative effectiveness in extreme combat conditions. Ultimately, this battle became a symbol of something far greater. The airfield, now located on Fonte Plateau, transformed into a powerful symbol of American industrial and military capabilities. It supported bombing operations that directly contributed to Japan's eventual surrender. B-29 crews, preparing for sorties to the Japanese mainland, drove past memorials marking the graves of the Marines. These soldiers had defended the land that was now vital for Allied victory in the Pacific. The transformation of a contested battlefield into a strategically crucial asset demonstrated the broader trajectory of the war and the decisive nature of a tactical victory achieved in one night of desperate fighting. This was not just a victory, but a turning point that changed history.